Hello guys, welcome to my channel. Kindly like and subscribe. Today we will discuss what is currently happening in Nigeria, and we are standing with Nigeria, hoping this will bring change to their country and worldwide. 10 days after millions of people took to the streets throughout Nigeria to demand an end to the bad administration for their country, many believe that the protesters failed to convey to the government how things are currently for Nigerians. However, some people do not view protest as legitimate. Under the hashtag and bad governance in Nigeria, organizers are calling for days of public protests from August 1st to 10th to bring the government's attention to the suffering of Nigerians. Protesters express their rage at the high cost of living, calling on the government to reinstate fuel subsidies, put an end to corruption, and improve governance, which negatively impacts millions of people in the most populous country in Africa. Protesters received 13 demands in total: tear gas use, purported extrajudicial executions by security personnel, theft and destruction of public and government property, and the flying of Russian flags are only a few examples. Numerous cities in Nigeria are witnessing deep protests. Monday Ubani, a human rights attorney, tells BBC News Pidgin that this particular demonstration raises certain issues. "I don't feel too at ease with the protest's scope. There are several aspects to this, including the desire to pillage, destroy, assault, carry foreign flags back to their homeland, and restore military authority. They convey a different message and demonstrate that the government is correct when it says that this particular protest is not about poor governance and that it is the product of an ulterior agenda, particularly from political opponents who want to retake power by illegal and constitutional means." According to the former head of the Nigerian Bar Association's Ikeja branch, who spoke in an interview with BBC News Pidgin, "They convey a different message and demonstrate that the government is correct when it says that this particular protest is not about poor governance and that it is the product of an ulterior agenda, particularly from political opponents who want to retake power by illegal and constitutional means." According to the former head of the Nigerian Bar Association's Ikeja branch, who spoke in an interview with BBC News Pidgin, "What exactly are the takeaways from the demonstration against terrible governance in the end?" On Thursday, thousands of demonstrators staged marches around Nigeria's main towns, calling for immediate action to address the nation's food crisis, inflation, and economic suffering. Lagos, the commercial center of Nigeria, saw early protests in spite of a government move to put an end to protests. Marching toward the city center and business districts of Ikeja, Ojota, and Ojodu, the primarily young and human rights activists shouted, "We're hungry, don't kill us, enough of hunger and hardship, anti-poor policies, end hardship now." Combat-ready police blocked off Eagles Square, a major venue next to the federal secretariat in the nation's capital, making it impossible for protesters to march there. In order to prevent demonstrators from taking to the streets and the National Plaza in Abuja, the administration secured court orders in Lagos and Abuja. The local media said that there were no casualties reported. In order to reduce tensions and prevent bloodshed, the government has implemented a 24-hour curfew in the area, according to officials. Most companies, shopping malls, banks, markets, educational institutions, and offices were obliged to suspend activities due to the protest out of concern that it would turn violent. Police Chief Olakeod Egbitoken issued a warning against violence on Tuesday, but he also declared that demonstrators would be protected by police while they exercised their civic rights. After meeting with the chiefs of security services in Abuja, he declared, "We recognize the citizens' right to protest, and as security agencies, we will protect the right, but this right is only to peaceful protest." Protesters are calling for free education, fair justice, excellent governance, and constitutional changes, in addition to a reduction in the cost of food, gasoline, and energy. Idowu Salako, one protester, told Anadolu that the people are weary of anti-government policies. He denounced the expense of governing in an era of inflation. With a homemade sign that said, "End bad governation," he asked that President Bola Tinubu reduce the number of ministers and appointments. Adams Asmau, a protest organizer and coordinator of the Take Back Nigeria campaign, declared that despite the government's attempt to put an end to the rallies, they would go on peacefully in the nation's capital, Abuja. There is no violence in the protest. She addressed the assembly, saying, "We are asking the government to address hunger, the high cost of food, and create jobs for youths." The director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, Zainab Usman, a senior research fellow from Nigeria, stated that the current state of inflation is over 30%, indicating a once-in-a-generation economic disaster. According to her, since mid-2023, the naira has depreciated by around 80% versus the US dollar, causing the inflation of food prices to reach over 40%. Nigeria is facing economic difficulties due to rising living expenses from the high cost of food, fuel, cooking gas, medicine, and transportation. The National Bureau of Statistics reports that in June, inflation increased to 34.9% from 29.9% in January. Abuja, Nigeria. When Ismail Musa and his brother Jamilu heard the gunshots, they were out enjoying tea. Musa was shot with a bullet intended to scatter protesters in Kano State, northern Nigeria, as he attempted to hide behind a table. The 23-year-old hardly made it to the hospital's halfway point. In this oil-rich and most populated country in Africa, the cost of living issue that sparked the protests is the worst in a generation. By 2050, it is expected to overtake the United States as the third most populous country in the world, behind China and India. Nigerian security forces only acknowledged murdering one demonstrator, an adolescent who was shot dead by a warning shot, but they claimed to have employed appropriate means to put an end to the violence during the rallies. But 3 families, whose testimonies were confirmed by witnesses and footage from the scene, told the Associated Press that their loved ones had been slain by gunfire fired by security personnel. Nothing at all occurred during that demonstration to justify the use of live ammunition, stated Issa Sanusi, director of Amnesty International's office in Nigeria. With a shaky voice from crying, Musa's sister remarked, "All he said was mama." The Amnesty International office in Nigeria reports that Musa was one of the 22 people who lost their lives amid demonstrations against hunger and corrupt officials in Nigeria. The poverty rate in the country is at least 63%. The administration has had trouble generating employment. Additionally, the Northeast is still experiencing the longest war on militancy in history. According to the Food Agency, Nigeria's population of over 210 million people makes up 10% of the world's hungry, despite the country's wealth in oil. Even so, its lawmakers are among the highest paid in Africa, despite frequent accusations of corruption. Nonetheless, protesters disobeyed the orders and marched through the streets of those cities, as well as those of Kano, Bauchi, and Maiduguri in the north, and Port Harcourt and Ibadan in the south. After police used tear gas to scatter the crowd, demonstrators and police engaged in combat in the northeastern Maiduguri's epicenter over a terror attack that occurred 10 years ago. Aniata Yuang, a Nigerian researcher with Human Rights Watch, stated that this instance was not an exception to the custom of Nigerian security personnel responding to rallies with excessive force, which frequently results in fatalities. According to her, the threats that surfaced during the most recent protests did not require that level of response from the authorities. Some of the casualties were in more isolated locations where the suffering they were rallying against is more severe, but the majority of the dead were shot in the metropolitan centers where the rallies were centered. Before being struck by the gunshot that killed him, Bashir Mohammed Lawan was participating in a demonstration with other young people in one of these settlements, Rijir Lemo, in the Fag Council area of Kano State, according to his relatives. His sister Khadija said that it was time for the Muslim afternoon prayers and that an attempt to disperse the demonstrators ended in a fight that ended in gunfire. They were merely demonstrating, yet they were called thugs, Khadija said. Thus, those in poverty lack the authority to demand their rights. Justice for him is what we seek. Authorities worried that, as Nigerians prepared for the demonstrations, they would resemble the disorderly tax hike demonstrations that occurred in Kenya last month and served as a catalyst for the movement. The military positioned vehicles in the nation's capital, Abuja, and threatened to step in to put an end to any violence following the first day of operations on August 1st. Meanwhile, the police stationed thousands of personnel on the roadways. Conflicts with the police claimed the lives of several of the victims. However, some, like Abbas Kabiru, died nearby, unencumbered by the mayhem. Kabiru, 36, was struck by a gunshot that his siblings claimed was fired by soldiers pursuing protesters when he and his brothers were watching the protests in front of the family compound in the Rigasa town of Kaduna State. His father Baba stated that after 4 days, the Nigerian military has not gotten in touch with the family. An inquiry was not immediately answered by the Nigerian military. Only one protester's death, a 16-year-old kid, has been confirmed by the military. He was killed by a warning shot after demonstrators attempted attacking some soldiers who had been sent in to put an end to the violence. Since the tragic EndSARS protests against police brutality in 2020, which left protesters dead or injured after security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters, this is Nigeria's first significant coordinated protest. He continued by saying that Nigerians were hurting to see their leaders live in luxury while they were having financial difficulties.